Hello and welcome to a cover story conversation. In fact, this conversation could not have been better timed. We have a 2 week ceasefire announced in the war with Iran. This was mediated in Pakistan. Donald Trump announced it. He said that the 10-point proposal issued by Iran was a workable one. Iran has also endorsed it, of course, with conditions of its own. But how workable is it? Is this ceasefire going to last, or are we going to see, again, the hostilities start again? That is something I'm going to be discussing with my panel today. I have with me Ambassador Casey Singh. He is a former diplomat and a strategic affairs editor. He's been the ambassador to Iran and UAE, an area he knows very well, as is also very obvious from some of his comments and tweets and interviews on social media. In fact, Casey, you predicted this would happen, I think, back in January when you were saying that Israel is overplaying its hand. You cautioned India for not falling into that narrative also. So, well, all this is, and you actually predicted the way events would turn out. So, congratulations on that. And
Thank you.
Suhasini Haider, she's the diplomatic affairs editor of The Hindu, and someone who's always been arguing that India's approach to multilateralism should also be driven by its our own strategic and economic interests. So today is a very important day, Ambassador Casey Singh. How do you first read the ceasefire, and your first take on that?
Look, I don't know if you've seen it. Last night before sleeping, I put out a tweet. It was a risky tweet. I said, my take is that when they get close to the detonation point, that's where you start assessing the benefits and the losses that you can incur, benefits you can gain, and that they may just back off. Because for Iran, victory was simply survival, and they have survived. And they have been able to retaliate. They are not hiding in a cave. And they've taken GCC hostage, they've taken the Gulf of Hormuz hostage, and its impacts are global on global economy, energy. And I think this is something that US had not. New York Times has carried a story. Now they're blaming Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, that he misled Trump, even though Trump's own team, now they're trying to sort of be hands off and say that they were actually giving a contrarian view that we shouldn't go in, government will not fall. All that was known. But, killing the leader and the supreme leader of Iran and imagining that after that the government is going to fall, that we are popular uprising is just, no reading at all of Iranian mind, Iranian civilization, Iranian past. This wasn't Venezuela, this was Iran. And I think they discovered at a great cost. So it's a good thing it's happened. And you can see that Iran is already at an advantage, where earlier the focus used to be only on the enriched uranium,
Correct.
400 kgs of enriched uranium, and their civil nuclear program. Now the focus is also on the Gulf, which they are controlling, and they even talk to Oman. Because I had made this argument earlier that they can't compare this to the Panama Canal or to the Suez Canal, because it's not just going through Iran. It's an international channel where the southern coast belongs to Oman. So I think they managed to get Oman on board, and they are saying that we will charge the ships when they go through. And that is something. So that's why when they made the point, the 10-point demand, in that demand, they were asking for reparations. They're not asking for reparations now. So they're saying that we will impose a certain amount, of $1 a barrel, which comes to about 2 million barrels per ship. The 20 million barrels go through the Gulf every day. So you're talking of 20 odd million dollars coming to them, at least $20 million coming. So they said, we need that for reconstruction. So Americans will have to do that. There's no way they're going to pay money for all the damage they've done to buildings and to infrastructure in Iran. Secondly, the other points will be discussed, and I think Iran will step back. For instance, saying no military presence of US in the entire region, that's not going to be accepted finally. By that means they will not even help Israel. That'll not be there. But there would be certainly some guarantees will be there. They're wanting a UN Security Council endorsement of the ceasefire so that they are not attacked again. Because it happened in June last year. And that's when President Trump said, I've destroyed all their nuclear facilities. And now it's back again to say, I'm not taking, I want to seize their uranium. So you can't do it every 8 months or 10 months whenever Netanyahu thinks he might be going to jail because of corruption charges or his elections coming up. You can't start attacking Iran. And I think that's where probably we are not seeing it. There's a silent hand of China, and with them, Russia. Pakistan's only fronting. I don't think Pakistan alone, Saudis are backing them, but it's given Pakistan a great diplomatic opening. And because if you have the army chief of Pakistan speaking directly to the US president, you can imagine what kind of a relationship they've been able to imagine, how the doors have opened. So this will be a diplomatic challenge for India because the last 10 years, the BJP approach has been to isolate Pakistan diplomatically, not talk to them directly, and internationally isolate them. And this is the reverse of that. They're not getting isolated. They're getting, as somebody tweeted just now, asked me, will they give a Nobel Peace Prize to Nawaz Sharif? I said, to Shahbaz Sharif.
Shabas.
I said, no, he's very smart. He'll pass it on to Trump. I don't think he's going to do that. Yeah. So we are in a new thing. We have to see that there'll be a difficult negotiation, and in that negotiation, nuclear issue was almost settled when they were talking in Oman, when they started the attacks on them in June, and then they started this attack again. And the difference is very little. The difference is Iranians want to, till now, Trump has been saying, dismantle every piece of nuclear facility that you have. Iranians are saying, no, we want to retain civil nuclear facility because, IAEA can supervise it. And they're signatories to the NPT. And I remember this was towards the end of my term in Iran, 2005. We had gone and voted against them, that IAEA, because the Americans were pushing us for an agreement, nuclear deal with them. They wanted us to vote against Iran. And Mr. Ali Larijani, who's been killed, then he had just taken over as the Secretary of the National Security Council. And he collected all the diplomats and he was speaking there. And he started indirectly attacking India. He said there are countries that, which have a nuclear program that the Americans are talking to, etc. I raised my hand and he said, yes. And I said, Excellency, perhaps you're ignoring that we never signed the NPT. What I was implying was you signed the NPT and you got AQ Khan to come in and breach it by starting an illegal program here. No, he didn't like it at all. And some of the ambassadors told me later, yeah, you really dare to stand up. I said, I'm not going to keep sitting. If somebody is trying to, attack my country indirectly. So that was my interaction with Larijani. But essentially, they will not give up entirely. America will have to accept IAEA, which means where are you going back to? You're going back to JCPOA that Obama negotiated, which Trump threw out of the window. He's been under the Israeli influence from his first term. And Abraham Accords were nothing more than an attempt to isolate Iran, get as many Arab countries, particularly from the GCC, to normalize relationship with Israel and create an anti-Iran alliance. Now that has come apart.
In fact, that's the big question for asking. How long will the ceasefire hold also? It's all because Iran, we talk about Iran and the US. Israel has, for instance, tweeted that Lebanon is not part of the ceasefire. Strait of Hormuz, Iran has said that it should be under Iran military control, but Donald Trump has now said that US will also be involved in it and big money will be made. So already loopholes are coming up in this ceasefire agreement.
Well, I think firstly, one has to remember that even with, for example, Operation Sindoor last year, for a few hours, at least 24 hours after any kind of an agreement to stop firing, there will be some amount of push and shove. There will be some local commander who will try his luck. I think this morning we've seen some strikes in some parts of the Gulf as well. From Iran. So the real proof will be in the long term holding of basically no strikes on, say, civilian facilities, no strikes on energy facilities and that kind of thing. The second part, as you said, is what kind of an agreement is going to come. So we have this 15-point from the US. We have a 10-point agreement that the Iranians have also put out. The most important part of that will be in terms of the Hormuz Strait, because this was a problem created in a sense by the US's invasion and the US's threatening of Kharg Island. And then what we have seen is this has now become a new place of negotiation. So in a sense, you're not even negotiating what you were in the past. And then it remains to be seen how this plays out, because Iran said very clearly that control will remain. Some reports saying that this 2 million per ship, according to Iran's discretion may also be a part of it. What is really interesting and what many may not have focused on is that Iran continuously says it will be along with Oman, shared with Oman. And Oman has very specifically been in talks with Iran about trying to find alternate channels. So one channel nearer to Iran is perhaps needed because of also security reasons, and Iran needs to defend itself. But a second channel may appear. I'm not an expert on these issues, but I certainly have seen a lot of back and forth between Oman and Iran over the last few days as well. So that's one possible area where we have to see how this is going to play out. The third area, as Ambassador Singh said, is on nuclear. What kind of guarantees? Because according to conversations, Iran was willing to give all the guarantees that the US wanted prior to this war, and the US went and bombed anyway. So now it's the guarantees that the US has to give that they will not try and attack in the middle of this. Unfortunately, the US has really done a disservice to talks and diplomacy by continuously, and this happened last year as well, by continuously bombing right in the middle of talks, and especially talks that are going well. It's not as if people had walked off the table. They had met in Vienna, in Geneva just 2 days before. They were going to meet in Vienna after that. So I think these are the three things that will decide how long this ceasefire goes. One, the actual physicality of the strikes. The second is what happens with Hormuz. And the third is nuclear. The other parts, reparations, the reconstruction, the terrible damage that has been done to the international order, I don't think any of those can really go back to the way they were before February 28th.
But I'm going to take a break and take the point from the where you left off is what will the new world order look like? What will the Middle East? I mean, Casey did talk a bit about the realignment in the Middle East, but what are things stand as of now where US stands, US vis-a-vis China, India vis-a-vis Pakistan, the Russia-Ukraine issue? So that's something we're going to be discussing, but after a quick break. Hello and welcome back to a cover story conversation. We are taking a look at the war, the Iran-US-Israel war. Ambassador Casey Singh, now what will the new world order really be? You know, we're talking about realignments. US has been diminished considerably. That has been at the cost, of course. Well, China has now played its cards very well. How will we see the two superpowers behaving, for instance, China, Russia, and the US?
China and Russia have been very closely watching it. One, they've been looking at the US weapons. They've been seeing how Iran has been able to counter them, what works against US planes, even the F-35. The aircraft carriers fled. So many of those things are applicable to what China would be planning for Taiwan. So it's actually a big negative because the Chinese have gained so much by watching this, supporting Iran, maybe introducing some technologies there, allowing their GPS system to be used, that they have become wiser by just sitting back and watching and indirectly participating. So in the new world order, Trump is going to be meeting China. He's always, in the past, also called it a G2. So there's a new bipolarity that is emerging, which is what India always dreaded. You wanted a multipolar order. You don't want a new bipolar order. It used to be Soviet Union and US, and now it becomes Russia plus mainly China and the US. So in this kind of a bipolarity, you'll have to start doing your equations again. Whom do you work with? Because if you align with one side, the impression at the just before the conflict, because of PM's visit to Israel, the impression was created that we're aligning with one side. We may not have been doing that, but that's the perception that developed. Now, how do you remove that perception? We have reached out. We did delayed sort of condolences, dealing with Iran. You could see there was a reluctance to deal with Iran right as the war broke out. Whereas Pakistan rushed in. They were dealing with everyone right from the beginning, and that kind of allowed them to then continue to play a role. So we'll have to start now sort of recalculating how do you want to do it. You go back to your non-alignment. It's essentially that is what worked when there's a bipolarity or a tripolarity, and you're not being allowed to, and you're not as yet big enough to be a major pole yourself. You'll have to buy time, and therefore to buy time, which is what There are many who have criticized non-alignment, but people are founding, members of India who created India. They were not stupid. They realized in that non-alignment enabled India to slowly grow during that period. So we'll have to now recalculate and do, for instance, you take GCC or Qatar, because they share a major gas field with Iran. They've said that they want the American troops to leave. So if the troops are leaving Qatar, then other countries have to think about it. Because tomorrow, if there is a fight, you don't want a problem to develop, because you've seen the damage done to UAE, UAE's reputation, Dubai's reputation as a city which was to which almost anybody with money wanted to go because the taxes were low, it was safe, accessibility was tremendous. So all those things will have to be redrawn. Turkey is a gainer because many of those flights have now gone to Turkey, and Istanbul is becoming a center from where the flights can then operate and which is considered safer. That's why Israel news is leaking that Israel says Turkey is next on a list. I don't think anybody will be on their list if America steps away. Very clearly, Israel by itself can't do it. And the lesson that America has learned, that what they had gained since Trump's first term, they have lost it in this one, and they cannot, because they wanted to dominate the region, have the ruling family members of the GCC and Israel control the entire region. They had replaced the government in Syria. They had killed all the top leadership, Hezbollah. So they thought, now let's get rid of the regime in Iran, and then it's happiness thereafter. That hasn't happened. The reverse has happened. So now there'll be new equations and new kind of diplomacy is required. New Delhi will have to rework on it, and I think it's a challenge.
Challenge for New Delhi, Suhasini, and also can can US step away from Israel? I don't know. This relationship is as to who is the principal player in this relationship between US and Israel.
Well, at the end of the day, the US-Israel relationship has stayed together because of popular support. And I think the case is being made that not just right now with what Israel has supposedly pushed a global leader like the US into doing.
Right.
If the US is some child and doesn't really know, and it can be led by the nose. But I think there is a genuine, since 2023, a genuine degradation in the support Israel has got in the United States because of its violation of international humanitarian law. And if, therefore, they lose political support in the US, it will be less, because you see it with American politicians. No president, nobody can speak any kind of criticism of Israel because it used to be politically very difficult to do. But if that changes, then you may see a different policy. I do think that the US works on its own. And it can hold anybody else responsible. But at the end of the day, there is no explanation for why a country that is in the middle of talks goes in, assassinates the leader of another country, torpedoes a ship, kills 80 sailors on the high seas, does not even try to rescue them. There's a series of war crimes here that the US may or may not be held responsible for, but as a supposedly responsible leader of the world, it is being held accountable for. You asked the question on where the world order goes next, and I think that is important, but I think it's very important to see where the regional order goes next, because it's impossible to ignore the fact that this particular last minute, ceasefire just before a deadline ran out with all the tensions we had seen a day ago has come about because Pakistan led the way in terms of bringing the two sides together. Many thought this wouldn't really work. But we have seen in the last 24 hours that Pakistan has been at the center of it. And certainly the fact that the Pakistan foreign minister, straight after his four-nation talks in Islamabad last week, which was with Egypt, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia, then went to China. You see the Chinese role in terms of vetoing the UN Security Council resolution against Iran just yesterday. You see the Chinese role in some of the statements they've made. So there's no question that, in a sense, these two countries will see themselves as having come out much better after this negotiation. So what does that mean for the region? Will India find less support to some of its very valid concerns over Pakistan in the near future because of the way that balance has shifted? I think regional is one. The second question has to be asked about, okay, so the world order is not really working as it used to, but the United Nations still can be made to count for something. The
Yeah.
problem is that India has succumbed and complied with unilateral sanctions from the US since 2019. Since India gave up Iranian oil, then it gave up Venezuelan oil. More recently, it tried to give up Russian oil. Also complied with the US's various threats against Chabahar, giving up the railway line, giving up investment, and finally just pulling out all its personnel from there. Now, these are all sanctions that should be revisited for India's point of view. Put the UN front and center, as India has always done. Say we don't accept these unilateral sanctions on where we can buy oil from, where we can invest, where we can have assets, for example. I think that is the second part. And as Ambassador Singh said, I think there has to be an understanding that India is not has not benefited by picking a side. So you can call it non-alignment, you can call it strategic autonomy, you can call it multipolarity or multilateralism or whatever you like. But at the end of multi-alignment, but at the end of the day, it stems from the same idea that India stands on its own and tries to build relationships that broaden its possibilities without picking one side or the other. The visit by Prime Minister Modi to Israel at the time that he went,
Yeah.
he has been before, at the time that he went, when it was clear conflict was underway, looked like it was picking a side. I think in the last month, 5 weeks, we've seen a coming back to the center of that equation.
Last question, but how do you see, Ambassador, the relationship between Iran and India? Suhasini's outlined some of the steps and missteps, but Iran has been showing tremendous goodwill. How do we go forward from here?
Iranians are pragmatic. Even in the past, when we voted against them at IAEA, they were unhappy, as I told you. But that doesn't mean that they have other concerns. We have a Shia population here. Don't forget, out of, say, 180 to 1 million Muslims in India, 15-20% are Shias. Say 30 to 40 million Shias, that's half the population of Iran. That's the largest Shia population, maybe other than in Pakistan, is in India. And they look at that link. And that is something Prime Minister Vajpayee understood because he fought from Lucknow. So he understood the role of Shia connection to Iran. And the Iranians are not going to give it up. Iranians know there's a cultural connection, there's a religious connection. And they also realize that, they need large friends, they need a market, they need someone to sell their oil to. Our rice goes from here, we export rice to them. So there is a natural connection, which is not with China. There's a natural connection with India, which is much older. And we have to, as Swasni put it, I think we have to rebalance. Just because another country tells you not to deal with them. We've seen the disadvantages of that. So we are now going into a world where many of these relationships will have to be revived. You'll have to rebalance your relationship with many other countries. You can't just base it on, no, we will get a trade deal. So under that pressure, you keep doing certain things. Then it's your image as a rising power, your image as a leader of the global South, that begins to get affected. I think we have to now focus back on that, show that we can stand on principled basis. Then Iran will come back to you. There's no problem. They will deal with you. They will remember. They don't forget hurts and slights. That is true. But we'll have to, use a relation, new contacts and new engagement to get over it, and we can put it in the background.
And we are still the chairperson of BRICS, so maybe we can, do something. But last thing, Suhasini, Donald Trump's future, he has that crucial midterm coming up. There is also talk of impeachment again. Can he survive this storm?
I have to say, Priya, given what we have seen in the last 24 hours, that at the end of the day, he eventually blinked. There's unkind references to TACO going on, which stands for Trump always chickens out. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it is very clear that in the face of this huge pressure from the US, the Iranians stood up. When it came to this dire statement he made saying that civilization will be ended and will not be able to return, almost threatening a nuclear bomb, what did we see? We saw Iranians standing, making human chains on the bridges and
Yes.
surrounding the nuclear site, saying, okay, then, this is how we'll go. Now, if Mr. Trump is seen as being stood down like this, stared down like this, and then he backs down, this is worse than losing just the midterms. It means that the entire bullying tactics of the US that we have seen for the last year and more, whether it was on the sanctions, whether it was on the tariffs, whether it has been on basically telling people, I'll take a bit of Greenland, I will make Canada my 51st state, Panama Canal is renamed, and what he did this year in Venezuela, where he just kidnapped president and his wife. Finally, as I said, the assassinations and all the other actions by the US in Iran, that it means that all that bullying is now being challenged. And maybe I'm putting the cart before the horse here, but I do think that in a certain sense that his what is called the lame duck period of a presidency, which normally starts after a midterm, especially in the second term of a president, I think that might even start much earlier now.
Well, on that note, I don't know if it's positive or negative, but I think that is a note that Donald Trump must be really examining seriously. But I'm sure we'll have more conversations. Let's see how the next 2 weeks play out. But thank you so much for this, both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the Newsx YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.